Thanks, Jen, thanks. Well, yeah, it's amazing to be here today, and hey everyone, I'm Singh. And this photo of me was actually taken a decade ago right here in Toronto. In case you're wondering, yes, this is the most hipster photo of me in existence, and that's because this photo was taken on a rooftop over in Queen West, which, if you're not from Toronto, that's a very hipster part of Toronto. Well, at least it was about a decade ago, back when we were running this event, which was sponsored by Microsoft to promote their new Metro JavaScript applications. And that's because, you see, a decade ago was the era of JavaScript fatigue. There were new libraries and frameworks coming out all the time. Front-end applications were getting increasingly interactive, and the user's expectation was evolving in the same way. As a JavaScript developer, you had to keep up with that in order to be more effective at your job and fundamentally retain your job. Otherwise, you're going to be slowly irrelevant as more people learned those things and kind of just, fundamentally just took your job. So you kind of want to keep your job. Anyway, we used to host events to get people together and get them talking. The best way to learn and combat JavaScript fatigue is together as a community. We can learn from each other. So this photo was actually taken way back in 2009. Would anyone like to guess how old I was in this photo? 15, wow. Someone's very optimistic there. I was actually 19 in this photo when this was taken. So as you can't see any visible gray hair. Everything was still very, very young in that photo. But anyway, yeah, quite a bit younger in that photo there. But anyway, this was an event in 2009 where I was speaking about MongoDB and Redis, data modeling, data architecture, and that, which were two new databases that just came out at that time. And people were still kind of wrapping their head how to properly utilize them. So fundamentally just trying to combat JavaScript fatigue. That event was organized by Dan Tolliver, sitting next to me here, who plays a part in the next part of my story as well. Anyway, you see, these types of events in 2009 were hugely helpful for everyone that attended. Folks were just fundamentally asking for more of those types of events, and that's when I decided to create the Toronto JS community back in 2010. These days, it's grown to 17,500 combined members across platforms, where looking at those numbers today, it kind of blew my mind, like essentially getting that. And we've hosted 275 events in that time, averaging about 24 a year. Again, back when I started it, I was not thinking it would grow into anything like that. We were really just doing it because, essentially, we were finding value in these types of events and learning from each other and elevating our community together. But what it's become today is is quite astounding. So yeah. Fundamentally, a big reason why Toronto JS, or really any community, works is because of how they interact with their members. In my opinion, it's one of the few positive feedback loops that exist in nature in general, where fundamentally a community elevates its members, and its members fundamentally elevate that community. The more the community elevates its members, the more its members are enabled to give back to that community, and that cycle continues. It's one of the rare positive feedback loops that exist, and this is a very strong force, essentially, to leverage. But, essentially, what is a community in the first place? This is how I define communities. Communities are for recurring engagement around intersecting interests. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say there's me, there's Taz, and let's say I'm interested in JavaScript, developer experience, and Toronto. And there's other people interested in those things as well. So when I meet them, I have something to talk about, because we have a common interest. The more interests we have in common, the greater the intersectionality, and the stronger the bond you'll create with them, of course. And this is because if I have something in common with, let's say, you, we can have something to talk about. But I have nothing in common with, let's say, you, then we have very little to talk about. We have to spend a lot of time trying to find something to talk about, which is kind of awkward. That's also why presentations like the one I'm giving right now are very relevant for these types of communities, because it gives everyone in attendance something common to talk about at the end of the day and create those bonds and learn from each other together. Enabling those connections is fundamentally what's so important for communities. So looking at this graph, where those interests intersect is actually the perfect place to establish a community. So JavaScript in Toronto, there's Toronto JS. Developer experience in Toronto, there's Refactor DX. Folks interested in those things would benefit from those intersectionalities. Thus, it's good to have a community forming around that to create recurring events and content around them. Now, of course, these connections expand even further out of this view into a much larger social graph to generate even more compounding network effects of value. And those network effects are fundamentally responsible for about 70% of value in tech. So the fact that you can leverage this as well as the positive feedback loop I mentioned before, creates a very powerful effect that's fundamentally all provided through communities. And that's because fundamentally, communities compound in value. And I don't mean they compound in value for like me, an organizer, they compound in value for everyone that's part of that community. Remember that positive feedback loop I mentioned before, communities elevate its members elevates the community again, and that compounds over time. So I think of a community, like, I think this is an ideal circumstance that you want in really anything in life, is you ideally want effort as the blue line to remain constant and then value to compound and grow over time. That's really an ideal case scenario. To put it another way, what you don't want is something that looks like this, where let's say the blue line, the effort increases linearly as value increases as well. You're doing more work for like, marginally more gain as you kind of go on over time. But I think this is perhaps a more realistic example where effort increases linearly, but the value increases in a much more compound way. And I think communities are a perfect example of this because of all those forces working together. And yeah, I just want to be clear again, this is value to the community as a whole, not just value to one individual. I think that's what communities are about at the end of the day. So needless to say, Toronto.js is community first. Who would have guessed, right? And while it might seem obvious right now, it wasn't so obvious over a decade ago when I founded it, and that was because corporate initiatives come and go. And what I found back then was that whenever a corporation has some sort of initiative, they would start a community. Let's say they're hiring. So they'd start a community. They'd have like a few events around that community. They'd hire who they needed, and the community would just no longer exist. Like essentially their initiative came and went, and so did that community. They'd also throw away all those benefits I mentioned. They wouldn't be elevating their members anymore. There wouldn't be a community to even do that in the first place. All that compounding value is just kind of gone away. And so what we wanted to do with Toronto.js was make that the fundamental community and fundamentally accommodate those corporate initiatives in a new way. The way that I thought about this back then was that communities are recurring, and they're there to enable that engagement and create those strong bonds across the intersectionality of interest, et cetera, as I mentioned before. But really, it's the events that are ephemeral. So events, just like corporate initiatives, come and go. That's the proper medium to engage with someone that's hiring or another company that's, let's say, trying to promote their new product or something like that. That initiative will come and go just like the event, but that community should stay there and continue with that recurring engagement for the people and their common interests. So fundamentally, that kind of begs the question, I've spent a lot of time talking about this from the community's perspective. Let's switch over to the corporation's perspective now. How does a corporation actually engage with a community? How do you capture developer interest for a corporate initiative? Well, I think, needless to say, it should be obvious at this point that obviously you should be supporting your existing communities. Let's get that one out of the way, because maybe that's the obvious one. And you can do that, of course, via sponsorship, talking to that community, seeing what their sponsorship package looks like, and listening to them, and kind of following that process. You can also submit content, of course. If you have some fantastic content that you're developing in-house that you want to share with that community, of course, that's another fantastic way to engage. And fundamentally, just talk to that community and just listen to what that audience needs. I think my key thing, a core piece of advice to keep in mind here is to try to be as agnostic as possible with the content you're providing. You don't want like 10 ways to use my product, you know what I mean? Like that's not going to go down so well with the community. You want to talk about, let's say, like the things that you've considered while working on your product, like the greater landscape around your inspiration for that product, things like that, and maybe lead them on the journey that would then naturally lead them to your product, for example. So try to be as agnostic with your content as possible, and that's what's worked typically best with communities. Number 2, enable local ambassadors. So if you have a developer platform and people are already passionate about it and they already exist in areas, get in touch with them. Find those people. I'm sure they've already found you, and talk to them and try to enable them. Try to send them swag perhaps to share with other people. Hop on a Zoom call with them and see what they're interested in. Maybe give them early access to a feature and just fundamentally just listen to them and try to enable them as much as possible. Number 3, create an internal community. So this one's interesting. I find a lot of folks haven't quite thought this one through, or maybe they want to do it, but they're just in early stages. And what I found was that your internal group of developers that you're already working with, they're of course already experts in that domain. They already know that product in and out. You're working with it with them and it on a daily basis. Like what if you had, like lunch and learns, where maybe someone demos like a PR or something that they've been working on? Like what if you had, again, like demo days, as I just mentioned as well? Like what if you create this internal culture of sharing and learning together, which fundamentally replicates what a public community looks like? Just do that internally, right? The benefit of this as well is that you're fundamentally coaching everyone that's there that's already an expert on that domain to get more comfortable with sharing and talking more publicly as well, thus giving back to a public community and thus essentially building a local ambassador network in and of itself, right? And this is really quite simple to do. All you have to do is say, hey, like you've worked on something cool. Would you like to demo it at this lunch and learn or whatever? Or like, hey, like we're going to do monthly demos where everyone gets to demo what they've what they've done in that past month. It's actually quite simple to do, and I would highly encourage doing more of this. And again, tying into that loop of internal sharing promotes more public sharing and so on and so forth. Number 4. Listen to Ellen Chisa's talk. And so when I say that, I specifically mean this talk here, which you can search on YouTube. She's a partner at Boldstart. It's a VC firm. I'm personally just a big fan of Ellen and all the different ways that she thinks about DX. I'm not even going to try to explain it as well as she has, so I'd highly recommend just checking out this talk. But if you don't know Ellen, she's the creator of a programming language called Darklang. Don't worry at all if you haven't heard of Darklang, that's totally fine. The interesting part here is how she's considered all of the various aspects of developer experience when crafting and promoting Darklang. In this particular slide, she talks about creating that flow channel in between skills and challenges to keep users constantly engaged as they traverse through your developer experience. Now, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. Definitely check out her talk. She does a way better job of explaining everything than I am, and primarily she's doing that from a programming language creator's perspective. Well, of course, I'm describing it from more of a community perspective, so definitely check out her talk. But the one thing that I really loved about her talk was how she ends with this beautiful quote that sticks with me every time I think about DX, which is, "We don't want magic. We want to be the magicians." And I think that very elegantly and accurately describes what type of developer experience you should be trying to create. You don't want something that's just, magical and kind of foreign and nobody really understands. You want to bring your audience on the journey with you. You want them to feel like they're the ones creating that magic. You want them to be the magicians. Cool. So I think at a very high level, those are my notes of how we've successfully scaled Toronto.js. And for me, on a very personal level, it's amazing being here today, of course, and getting all the cheers and everything. Thank you so much. And seeing all of that, of what we created back then, still running better than ever. For those of you that don't know, I actually moved to London, UK about 7 years ago, and thus it wouldn't really make sense for me to run a community in Toronto from London, and so I handed off to the current organizers, like Jen Chan sitting over here at the front, and all the other organizing members that are here with us today. And again, thanks for Ahmad for organizing this event in Toronto and involving Toronto.js as well. That's what community is about, fundamentally, at the end of the day. It's awesome to see events like this happening, so thank you so much. All of these things helps to elevate the community and help elevate its members, which in turn creates that positive feedback loop around this intersectionality of interests. And fundamentally, I strongly believe those fundamentals is what made Toronto.js and communities like it so resilient that people like myself can move to a different continent and other folks can run it to completely new heights that I would have never even imagined. So thank you so much for that. But everything that's happened there and kind of everything I've talked about there is really, for me, the next part of my journey, which is working on Guild. So I've taken the core lessons of Toronto.js, scaling it and working with communities around the world to create a home for communities to scale and elevate people together, no matter where they are. We're fundamentally trying to build this platform to take away all those manual lessons we learned from Toronto.js and just build it into something that's going to be better for everyone. Let me just give you a quick little demo of what we built. So I need to switch displays. Cool. Should be able to see my screen. Let's make that a bit bigger. So this is Guild as a platform. I'll show you a few cool things we built, actually. So I love this cool little navigation there. It's kind of cool. And as you can see, we're the platform for communities no matter the shape, with a nice little shape-shifting background, all built in WebGL. So I think that's kind of cool. The small little details are what really excite me. And so down here you can see a community with its events and presentations. And in fact, I think on this one here, I might have given a talk where you can see a bit more about how we actually built this. So this is a talk I gave at the Chain React conference a couple months ago, and I go into much more detail about how we actually built this whole platform. So I'd highly recommend checking that out if you're interested in running React Native on a web platform and then other platforms and so on and so forth, and just fundamentally building this experience for Guild to exist anywhere. But anyway, that's that. Let me go back. Oh no. There we go. So the interesting thing about this is that this community here is actually a network of other communities. So again, trying to create that intersectionality and trying to balance those corporate initiatives with community initiatives as well, where they can kind of both coexist together. Another example of this is Gitpod, where they're utilizing Guild to create a brand ambassador network that's, again, also interconnected with those local communities. So you can see that Gitpod is its own network of communities. Gitpod London, for example, has its own events and presentations and members and so on and so forth. And its network is, again, intersected with the London JavaScript network, which itself has its own set of communities. So again, kind of going back to what I was mentioning before, we're trying to leverage as much intersectionality of interest to try to balance those initiatives as they make sense. Something else we did with this platform is, again, as I mentioned, it has events and presentations and so on and so forth. It'll soon have members and, discussions and so many other things kind of built into it. And, feel free to go take a look at Guild on your own, just guild.host. There it is. We do in-person events, hybrid events, and so on and so forth. This graphic I find quite interesting because none of those people exist. They're actually all generated by AI. So actually, we took Midjourney to create all of these people, and then we put those people through Midjourney again to create these people. And so it's actually an AI creation off an AI creation that creates those people. And yeah, we also do hybrid events where half of them are one avatar and the other half of the other. We have presentations directly on the platform, and fundamentally the networks I mentioned before to help balance those intersectionality of interest that I was talking about earlier on. Feel free to go check out Gitpod's docs on running everything on Guild as well. It could be interesting if you're trying to run a brand ambassador program. I'm not going to go into too much detail other than it's just online, so you can go check that out on your own. And then a third interesting thing that we've done is taken all of these different components that build the site and made them cross-platform embeddable. So you can actually take any component on Guild and put that anywhere, whether that's a web platform, like a mobile platform, or a desktop platform. So by leveraging React Native, we can actually take an experience and ship that everywhere, because fundamentally communities exist everywhere, and communities exist in all these different shapes and sizes that we want our experience to also exist in all those different shapes and sizes as well. So I'd recommend just taking a look at this if you'd like. But yeah, let's go back to the presentation. Something else we're doing is to help corporate initiatives and brands better connect with communities is building, so essentially right now, this is the way that a brand would connect with a community. You would have to go discover those individual communities, negotiate a deal with them, perform a transaction with them, and try to measure some sort of return, which is very difficult and annoying and results in far fewer brands actually interacting with communities. And on the community side, you have to manage all your content and moderation and platforms, create those sponsorship packages, negotiate that deal, perform the transaction, display the sponsorship, and aggregate the metrics. It's like, oh my goodness. On top of actually managing community, that's a lot. So how does that actually look like with Guild? Basically, we take on a lot of the annoyances of that, where now all a brand has to do is say, hey, we want to target, let's say, JavaScript developers in Toronto. That's our criteria. Guild will match that with any matching communities, let's say Toronto.js and so on and so forth, leaving Toronto.js to just focus on running a great community, getting their content running and keeping their engagement running. And Guild takes care of everything else. We'll aggregate the metrics, we'll transfer the funds, we'll do all of that stuff as well. So for a corporation to actually promote their initiatives, it actually becomes dramatically easier, and fundamentally, essentially opens up the community to focus on what they want to do, which is elevating its members, focusing on content, and focusing on engagement, instead of all of the other things that goes into running a community that you just fundamentally rather leave to a platform like Guild that's a bit more specialized for it. Something else that we're doing, and a particular interest of mine, going back to this diagram from before, is I have a background in cognition, AI, lexical networks, cognitive topology. So this type of diagram here reminds me of a lexical network. Essentially what I mean by that is if you're familiar with language learning models, which is in the vogue right now, basically how those work is by analyzing grammar, and then the words that you have in that grammar create essentially a lexical graph of cognitive topology, and you can actually measure that to define semantics, so what someone means. If I say, I am going to the store, the grammar of that sentence and the words that I'm using defines what I'm doing, right? The trouble with language learning models is language. And so the way that I might say something might be very different than the way someone else might say something, or the way that someone might say something on the internet, or via SMS. Oftentimes it's not perfect grammar, and oftentimes it's not perfect English, right? It's some sort of quick form or something, right? And so language makes analyzing grammar very difficult. And so about a decade ago, I was curious, hey, what if we, what exists out there that is guaranteed to be good grammar at all times? And what I thought was, hey, how about a social network where the types of interactions you can perform on that social network basically start to form a grammar of the system, and the interactions themselves are actually the semantics of that system. So you can think of it in a lot of ways similar to a language learning model, but it actually enables you to define the semantics of a system. So that's essentially the model that I prototyped about a decade ago. It worked quite well, and so we're actually utilizing it at Guild as well, primarily to help create those stronger bonds, help create those intersectionality of interest, and help elevate communities all around the world. So you can kind of think of this model as something like that as well. But yeah, I think fundamentally, for me, those are my notes. I know I might have rambled on about a million different things, but such is a community at the end of the day. I think the key things to keep in mind are, as I said, leverage those compounding effects. A community is a perfect home for those compounding effects, for that positive feedback loop of elevating its members, of elevating its community, for the intersectionality of interest to actually form a community, how to balance corporate initiatives with those compounding effects of a community, so you're not kind of throwing away the ephemerality of an initiative and kind of sacrificing a community. You need to kind of balance those things, and that's how we thought about it at Toronto.js. And at the end of the day, if you're interested in Guild, feel free to come talk to me as well. But for me, that's how I think of creating a community of champions. Thank you.
Thank you, Taz.